Metamorph Jack presents Star Wars Choices of One by Timothy Zahn. The choices of one shape the futures of all. Jedi saying. The last hyperspace jump had been a tricky one, starting as it did in one minor star system barely on the charts and ending in another even more obscure one. But the ISD Chimera's officers and crew were the finest in the galaxy, and as Commander Gilad Pellaeon looked over the repeater display, he confirmed that they'd made the jump precisely. He strode down the command walkway, gazing at the Chimera's long prow, wondering what in space they were doing here. The Chimera was an Imperial Star Destroyer, 1.5 kilometers of heavy armor and awesome weaponry, the very symbol and expression of Imperial power and authority. Even the arrogant anarchists of the rebellion hesitated before going up against ships like this. So with that same rebellion boiling ever more loudly and violently across the Empire, with Lord Vader himself tasked with tracking down and destroying their leadership, what in the name of Imperial Center was the Chimera doing on passenger transport duty? This is insane, Captain Kalo Drusen muttered as he came up beside Pellaeon. What in the galaxy is Command thinking of? It does seem a bit odd, Pellaeon said diplomatically, but I'm sure they have their reasons. Drusen snorted. If you believe that, then you're a fool. Imperial Center has gone top-heavy with politicians, professional flatterers, and incompetence. Reason and intelligence went down the garbage chutes a long time ago. He gestured at the starlit sky in front of them. My guess is that someone's just trying to impress everyone with his ability to move fleet units around. Could be, sir, Pellaeon said, a small shiver running up his back. In general, Drusen was right about the way the Imperial Court was going, even though a ship's captain shouldn't be discussing such things out loud. In this case, however, Drusen was wrong, because this particular order hadn't come from some flunky at Imperial Center. That was how it looked, and how it was clearly intended to look. Unlike the captain, though, Pellaeon hadn't taken the order at face value, but had taken the time to run a backtrack. While it had indeed come from the proper channels from Imperial Center, it hadn't originated there. In fact, it had come from an undisclosed location in the Outer Rim. According to the top-secret dispatches Drusen had shared with his senior officers, that was where Grand Admiral Zahn was right now, quietly touring the edge of Imperial space aboard the ISD Predominant, which strongly implied that the Chimera's orders had come from the Grand Admiral himself. Incoming ship, Captain, the sensor officer called from the starboard crew pit. Just jumped into the system. Sensors read it as a Cazelis-class light freighter. Drusen whistled softly. A Cazelis, he commented. That's a rare bird. They stopped making those years ago. We have an ID yet? Yes, sir, the comm officer called from the portside crew pit. Yes, sir, the comm officer called from the portside crew pit. Code response confirms it's the Sabalan's Hope. Pellaeon cocked an eyebrow. Not only had their mysterious passenger arrived, but he'd arrived within minutes of the Chimera's own appearance. Either he had a highly developed sense of timing, or he was remarkably lucky. Vector? Drusen asked. Directly starboard, the sensor officer called. Range 80 kilometers. Not only practically on top of the Chimera in time, but in position as well. Pellaeon's estimation of the freighter's pilot went up a couple of notches. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Criffing fool, Drusen grunted. What's he trying to do, run us down? Pellaeon took a few steps forward and peered out the starboard viewport. Sure enough, the glow of the sublight engine was just barely visible out there against the background of stars. Except that glow shouldn't have been visible. Not at that distance. Not unless the pilot was hauling his sublights for all they were worth, and then some. And the only reason someone would do that... Captain, I recommend we go to full alert, Pellaeon had said urgently, turning back to Drusen. That ship's running from something. For a moment, Drusen didn't reply, his eyes flicking past Pellaeon's shoulder to the approaching freighter. With an effort, Pellaeon forced himself to remain silent, letting his captain work through the logic in his own unhurried, methodical manner. Finally, to his relief, Drusen stirred. Full alert, the captain called, and reconfirmed that identity code, just in case he's not running from anyone, but thinking of ramming us. Pellaeon turned back to the viewport, hoping he'd been able to keep his bewilderment from showing before the captain could see. Did Drusen honestly believe that anyone would be stupid enough and suicidal enough to try such an insane stunt? Even the lunatics of the rebellion knew better than that. Still, as long as Drusen's paranoid assumption got the shields up and the turbo lasers charging. Incoming, the sensor officer snapped. 6 unidentified ships jumping in, bearing in sweep cluster pattern behind the Sabalan's Hope. Come about, Drusen said, his voice taking on an edge of eagerness. The captain loved it when he had the chance to fire the Chimera's turbo lasers at something. All turbo lasers to full power. Pelion grimaced. As usual, Drusen was following standard combat procedure, only in this case standard procedure wasn't going to work. By the time the Chimera was ready to fire, the attackers would have caught up with the Sabalan's Hope and be swarming it. But if the Chimera threw power to its sublight engines and headed straight for the freighter, they might scare off the attackers, or at least give them a moment of pause. Closing the distance would also mean getting the turbo lasers' effective range a little sooner. Captain, if I may suggest— No, you may not, Commander. Drusen cut him off calmly. This is no time for your fancy theories of combat. Captain, the Sabalan's Hope is hailing us, the comm officer called. Lord Odo requests your immediate attention. Pelion frowned. Lord Odo was the sort of name that belonged in the Imperial Court, not way out here in the Outer Rim. What would a member of the Imperial Court be doing this far from Imperial Center? Put him through, Drusen ordered. Yes, sir. There was a click. Captain Drusen, this is Lord Odo, a melodious voice said through the bridge speaker. As you may have noticed, I've come under attack. I have indeed, Lord Odo, Drusen said. We're charging the turbo laser batteries now. Excellent, Odo said. In the meantime, may I request that you shunt all other available power to the tractor beams and pull— Not a good idea, my lord, Drusen warned. At this range, a full-power tractor beam could severely damage your hull. That you shunt all power to the tractor beams, Odo repeated, a sudden edge in his voice, and pull the 2 endmost attackers toward you. And if we breach— Belated, Drusen broke off. Oh, yes, I understand. Ensign Callan, tractors on those 2 endmost raiders. Lock up and reel in. Pelion turned back to the viewport, a lump in his throat. The engine flares of the attacking ships were visible now, blazing against the stars as they drove hard on the Sabalan Hope's stern. Drusen had been right about the dangers of full-power tractor beams at this range. Clearly, that's what Odo was hoping for, that the Chimera's tractors would be strong enough to crack or even shatter the raiders' hulls. But if the attackers were stronger than Odo thought, all the maneuver would accomplish would be to pull 2 of the raiders forward into a close-fire range faster and easier than they could manage on their own. At which point the Sabalan's Hope would have the enemy lasers behind it and on both flanks, and it was unlikely that it would have enough shield capacity to handle all 3. Hissing softly between his teeth, Pelion watched. Abruptly, the 2 pursuing ships on the ends began corkscrewing violently, their drive trails spinning like children's wind sparklers. Tractors engaged, the tractor officer called. Attackers locked and coming towards us. Any sign of hull fractures? Drusen asked. Nothing registering, sir, the senior officer reported. Acknowledged, Drusen said. So much for that, he added to Pelion. Well, at least they can't fire on the Sabalan's Hope, Pelion pointed out. Not with that helix yaw. Well, at least they can't fire on the Sabalan's Hope, Pelion pointed out. Not with that helix yaw. Difficult to get a stable targeting lock that way, Drusen agreed, reluctantly. And then, suddenly, Pelion got it. Odo wasn't just hoping the Chimera's tractors would tear the attacking ships apart. He was letting the Imperials pull the raiders up alongside him, banking on the helix yaw to interfere with their own firing long enough. He was still working through the logic when the Sabalan's Hope's lasers flashed to either side, blasting the 2 tracted raiders to scrap. And as the expanding clouds of debris twisted free from the tractor's grip, they naturally and inevitably fell backward past the still accelerating Sabalan's Hope, and directly into the paths of the 4 raiders still chasing it. Captain, turbo lasers online, the weapons officer reported. Target the remaining attackers, Drusen snorted. That is, if there's still anything worth targeting. And alert the hangar bay duty officer that he has a ship incoming. He looked at Pelion. If this Lord Odo is a member of the Imperial Court, he murmured, at least he's a competent one. Yes, sir, Pelion said. Shall I take over here while you go down to welcome him? Drusen made a face. Fortunately, I'm too busy cleaning up this mess to bother with visitors, he said. You go. Get him aboard, get him settled, you know the routine. Tell him I'll be down to greet him as soon as we've made the jump to lightspeed. Yes, sir, Pelion said. Maybe I can get him to tell us exactly where that encrypted course setting we were sent is taking us. Don't count on it, Commander, Drusen said. The Imperial Court loves its secrets as much as anyone else. He waved a hand. Dismissed. Pelion had never before had the dubious honor of welcoming an actual member of the Imperial Court aboard his ship. But he had learned all the stories about the nobles' arrogance, their love of all things rare and expensive, and their colorful and sycophantic entourages. Lord Odo proved to be a surprise. The first person to emerge into the hangar bay from the docking tunnel was an old, frail-looking human, dressed not in lush and expensive colors, but in plain, drab pilot's garb. Dressed in a grey and burgundy hooded robe, black gloves, boots, and cloak, and the black metal full-face mask of a pantomime mute actor. There was no third person. If Odo had an entourage, he'd apparently left it behind. Pelion waited, just to be sure, until the pilot signaled for the boarding hatch to be sealed. As it closed with a thump, he stepped forward. Lord Odo, he said, bowing at the waist and hoping fervently that the visitor would forgive any unintentional lapses in proper court etiquette. I am Commander Gilad Pelion, 3rd Bridge Officer of the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera. Captain Drusen asked me to greet you, and to inform you that he'll pay his own respects as soon as his duties on the bridge permit. Thank you, Commander, Odo said in the same melodious voice Pelion had heard on the bridge, now muffled slightly by the mask. There was no mouth opening, Pelion noted, nor were there any eye slits. Either Odo could somehow see right through the metal, or else there was a compact heads-up display built inside. Are we on our way? Yes, sir, Pelion said, glancing at the nearest readout panel just to make sure. I believe the encrypted course data that arrived with your boarding authorization said it would be a 10 standard-hour journey. Correct, Odo confirmed. I trust you'll forgive my appearance. My reason for this visit must remain private and my identity unrevealed. No explanation necessary, sir, Pelion hastened to assure him. I understand how things are done in the Imperial Court. Do you now? Odo said. Excellent. Perhaps later you can instruct me on its more subtle aspects. Pelion felt a frown crease his forehead. Was Odo merely having a joke at a lowly fleet officer's expense? Or did he really not know the nuances of Imperial Court procedure and behavior? In which case, he was obviously not a member of the Imperial Court. So who was he? I trust you have quarters prepared for us, Odo continued. The journey was long and fraught with danger. The masked and hooded head inclined slightly. Speaking of which, may I also thank you for your assistance against those raiders? Our pleasure, my lord, Pelion said, wondering for a split second if he should point out that the main tactical thrust of the engagement had in fact been Odo's. Probably not. It wouldn't do for the Imperial fleet to admit that a visiting civilian had come up with a better combat plan than they had. And yes, quarters have been arranged just off the hangar bay for you and your pilot. He looked at the pilot and raised his eyebrows. Your name? The pilot looked at Odo, as if seeking permission to speak. Odo made no move, and after a moment the pilot looked back at Pelion. Call me Soro, he said. His voice was as old and tired as the rest of him. Honored to meet you, Pelion said, turning back to Odo. If you'll follow me, my lord, I'll escort you to your quarters. Exactly 9 3/4 standard hours later, even though it wasn't his watch, Pelion made sure to be on the Chimera's bridge. It was a waste of time. The Star Destroyer emerged on the dark side of a completely unremarkable world, with an unremarkable yellow sun peeking over the planet's horizon and an unremarkable starscape all around them. And we aren't likely to see anything else either, Drusen growled. We have orders to hold position right here until Lord Odo arrives. There he goes, Pelion said, pointing at the glow of the Sabalan's Hope Drive as the freighter emerged from beneath the Chimera's long prow. The freighter headed toward the planetary horizon ahead, its image fogging briefly as it circled past the edge of atmosphere, and then vanished. What do you think about that mask of his? With an effort, Pelion dragged his mind away from the mystery of where they were to the mystery of who Odo was. He definitely doesn't want anyone knowing who he is, he said. Who or what, Drusen said. I had environmental services do a scan of the airflow from his quarters. I thought... You what? Pelion interrupted aghast. Sir, the orders made it clear we were not to question, interfere, or intrude upon Lord Odo's activities. Which I haven't, Druso said. Keeping tabs on my ship's systems is part of my job. But, besides which, it didn't work, Drusen said sourly. There are 50 different species biomarkers coming off him. at least 8 of which the computer can't identify. Probably coming from his mask, Pelion murmured, remembering now the set of parallel slits set into the mask's curved cheekbone areas. I assumed the cheek slits were merely decorative. Apparently they're stocked with biomarkers, Drewson said. Clever little flimp, isn't he? Still, whatever the reason for his visit, it should be over soon and we'll be able to take him and his ship back where we found them. Unless he wants us to take him elsewhere, Pelion pointed out. What does he need us for? Drewson countered. He's got a ship and a pilot. Let him go on his own. He exhaled noisily. Well, there's no point in standing around waiting for him. I'm heading back to my quarters. I suggest you do likewise, Commander. Yes, sir, Pelion said. Giving the planetary horizon one final look, he followed Drewson back down the command walkway. Well? The Emperor asked. For a moment, Senior Captain Thrawn didn't answer. He merely continued to gaze out the viewport at the forested landscape stretched out below. An interesting situation, the blue-skinned chit said at last. Seated at the helm of his freighter, George Cardass kept his gaze straight ahead at the moon's horizon, wishing fervently that he was still in his self-imposed exile from the rest of the universe. Thrawn clearly didn't need him here. The Emperor clearly didn't want him here. But Thrawn had quietly insisted. Why, Cardass didn't know. Maybe Thrawn felt he owed Cardass. Maybe he thought he was doing Cardass a favor by bringing him into contact with the High and Mighty this way. Cardass also didn't know why the Emperor hadn't chosen to make an issue of his presence aboard. Maybe he regarded Thrawn highly enough to forgive the other's little quirks. Maybe he was just amused by Cardass's obvious discomfort. Cardass didn't know, nor did he really care, about anything. First of all, the multi-frequency force field you have set up should be more than adequate to protect the construction site, Thrawn said, gesturing past Cardass's shoulder at the huge half-finished sphere floating above the moon's surface. I trust the generator has redundant energy sources, plus an umbrella shield to protect it from orbital attack. It does, the Emperor confirmed. There are also a number of fully crewed garrisons in the forest around the generator. Has the moon any inhabitants? Primitives only, the Emperor said contemptuously. In that case, multiple garrisons are an inefficient use of resources, Thrawn said. I would recommend burning off the forest for 100 kilometers around the generator and putting a small mechanized force of AT-ATs and Juggernaut heavy assault vehicles under the umbrella shield. Add in point support from 3 or 4 wing clusters of hover scouts, and the rest of the troops and equipment could be reassigned to trouble spots elsewhere in the Empire. So you would suggest I make the generator completely unassailable? Palpatine asked. I assumed that was the intent. Thrawn paused, and Cardass glanced back in time to see the captain's glowing eyes narrow. Unless, of course, you're setting a trap. Of course, the Emperor said calmly. You of all my officers should understand the usefulness of a well-laid trap. Indeed, Thrawn agreed. One final recommendation. Don't dismiss too quickly those natives you mentioned. Even primitives can sometimes be used to deadly effect. They will not be a problem, the Emperor said, dismissing the natives with a small wave of his hand. They don't like strangers. Any strangers. I leave that to your judgment, Thrawn said. Yes, Palpatine said flatly. And now I sense you have a request to make. Speak. Thank you, Your Highness, Thrawn said. If he was surprised or discomfited by the Emperor's casual reading of his mind, it didn't show in his voice. It concerns a warlord named Nuso Ezva, who has become a serious power in the unknown regions. Palpatine gave a small snort. I wonder sometimes if you focus too much of your attention in those far reaches, Captain. It was you who authorized me to make such surveys, Thrawn reminded him. And properly so. The rebellion is a threat, but hardly the most serious one facing the Empire. In your opinion? Yes, Thrawn said. There was a short pause. Continue, the Emperor said. Warlord Nuso Ezva has become one of those threats, Thrawn said. He poses an unusually strong space-going navy, along with many slave and tributary worlds stretching into wild space and to the edge of the Empire. I believe he is even now planning to extend his influence into Imperial space. An alien, I presume, Palpatine said, his voice dripping with disgust. Can he be bought? Not bought, bargained with, or allied with, Thrawn said. I've sent several communiques to him suggesting each of those options. He's turned down all of them.
And what makes you think he wishes to extend his reach into my empire?
He's begun a campaign against some of the worlds at the edge of the territories I've pacified, Thrawn said. His usual pattern is to use hit-and-fade tactics on shipping, or attempt to bribe or otherwise suborn the officials of those worlds.
All of whom are also aliens,
Palpatine said with a sniff.
I have warned you before that such beings cannot be molded into any sort of permanent political structure. The history of the Republic proves that.
Perhaps, Thrawn said. The point is that Nuso Ezra is using these raids to pin down my forces, and the only targets I can see that are worth such efforts are in Imperial space. Obviously, this cannot be tolerated.
Then deal with him,
the Emperor said flatly. I intend to, Thrawn said. The difficulty is that my forces are already overextended and overcommitted. In order to deal a crushing blow, I'll need a minimum of 6 more Star Destroyers. Out of the corner of his eye, Cardass saw the Emperor's eyes narrow.
Do you seriously believe I have 6 Star Destroyers to spare, Captain Thrawn?
I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, Thrawn said evenly. It's not just the border sectors that are at risk either. There are indicators he may be making overtures to the rebellion.
Then perhaps you should speak with Lord Vader,
the Emperor said.
The rebellion is his special interest. Perhaps he can give you the Star Destroyers you require.
An excellent suggestion, Your Highness, Thrawn said, inclining his head. I may just do that.
It would be interesting to hear what the two of you have to say to one another.
The Emperor gestured.
We're finished here, pilot. Return us to the predominant.
Yes, Your Highness, Cardass said. Getting a firm grip on the yoke, he pulled the ship into a smooth curve and headed for the Star Destroyer orbiting the near distance behind them, wondering distantly if Thrawn realized what he was getting himself into. Sitting here with the Emperor and a silent pair of Imperial guards behind him was bad enough. But Vader was even worse. Ever since Yavin, every report Cardass had picked up had indicated that the appropriately titled Dark Lord of the Sith had grown a whole lot darker. The thought of asking him for anything, let alone 6 Star Destroyers, was something Cardass's mind wasn't up to. It hadn't always been that way. Once Cardass had been the head of an organization that had spanned the galaxy, a network of smugglers and information brokers who had serviced everyone from the Hutts to the highest levels of the Imperial Court. Cardass himself had been to the edge of Chiss space with Thrawn, back before the Clone Wars had ravaged the Republic. He'd worked with the young commander, watching as he defeated forces far larger than his own. Later, as Cardass's organization grew, he'd had many occasions to speak directly with some of the most powerful men in Palpatine's new empire. In those days, standing before Darth Vader would have been little more than an unusually interesting day. But that had been before Cardass's nearly fatal encounter long ago with that Dark Jedi, before his subsequent illness and weakness and impending death, before his abrupt decision to abandon his organization and leave it helpless before the infighting that was probably tearing it apart at this very moment, before he had given up on everything. Still, even with his past burned behind him and his future laying bleak and formless in front of him, Cardass could feel an unexpected and unwelcome flicker of curiosity stirring inside him. It really would be interesting to hear what Thrawn and Vader had to say to each other. Pellaeon had returned to his quarters, and had been asleep for nearly 6 hours when he was awakened by the insistent buzzing of his intercom. Rolling over, he tapped the key. Pellaeon, this is the captain. Drewson's voice was practically quivering with suppressed emotion. Report to the bridge immediately. The rest of the senior bridge officers were already assembled across from the aft bridge turbo lift when Pellaeon arrived. He eased his way through toward the front, noting uneasily that the group also included all off-duty engine room officers and the senior commanders of the Chimera's TIE Fighter, Trooper, and Stormtrooper contingents. Whatever was going on, it was big. He found Drewson waiting stiffly beside one of the consoles. Beside the captain, standing still and silent, was Lord Odo. Now that we're all assembled, Drewson said, his eyes flicking to Pellaeon, I have an announcement. We have been selected for the honor, he leaned on the word just a bit too hard, of acting as Lord Odo's personal transport on a special assignment. His lip twitched. As part of that assignment, Lord Odo will be in ultimate control of the Chimera, he continued. I trust all of you will respect his position and give him your full measures of skill, effort, and obedience. Questions? The first officer, Senior Commander Grondal, cleared his throat. May I ask the nature of this assignment? He asked. It's important, Odo told him evenly. For now, that's all you need to know. There was a brief, awkward silence. Have you orders for us, my lord? Drusen asked at last. Odo's hand came up from beneath his cloak, a data card in his gloved fingers. Here's our new course, he said, offering the card to Drusen. Our first stop will be the Runa system. And what exactly is it Runa? Grondal asked. Commander, Drusen said warningly. That's all right, Captain, Odo said. There's some specialized equipment that I'll need to fulfill our mission. The equipment is at Runa. As it won't come to us, we shall have to go to it. Grondal's eyes narrowed. But he knew better than to rise to the bait. Better officers than him, Pelion knew, had been shunted to nowhere stations for reacting to the sarcasm of superiors. Yes, sir, he said. Take this to navigation, Drusen said, handing Grondal the data card. Get us moving as soon as the course is loaded. Yes, sir. Taking the card, Grondal strode through the pathway that opened up for him as he headed through the archway into the main bridge. The rest of you, as you were, Drusen continued, looking around the group. The watch change is coming, don't miss it. He looked at Odo. Our new commander, he added, wouldn't like it. Pelion was back in his quarters by the time the Chimera had made the jump to lightspeed. There was, he judged, enough time to grab another 2 hours sleep before his next shift. But sleep wouldn't come. Lord Odo wasn't human. That much was pretty well guaranteed by the extraordinary means he had taken to disguise himself, with the mask and the confusing mix of biomarkers. Pelion himself didn't have anything against aliens, and in fact he had known and worked with quite a few whom he greatly respected. But the Emperor wasn't like that. His opinions of aliens were well known, and while he was willing enough to make alliances with aliens when it served his purposes, there were virtually none in the senior positions of the court or military. The only exception Pelion knew was of Senior Captain Thrawn, and even he was frequently sent away to the unknown regions to get him off Imperial Center for a while. So who was Odo? That was the question that kept chasing itself around Pelion's brain. Who was Odo? And what was this mission that was so important enough to take the Chimera off patrol duty and put it under an alien's command? Pelion didn't know, and it was clear that Odo himself wasn't going to tell him. But maybe there was another way. The Empire, after all, was the greatest repository of information the universe had ever known. Maybe Odo had left some trail somewhere that could be followed. Getting up, Pelion put on a robe and went to his desk. He turned on the computer and keyed the intercom for the duty security officer. This is Commander Pelion, he said when the officer answered. Where are Lord Odo and his pilot? Lord Odo is on the bridge, the officer replied. Soro is in their shared quarters. When was Soro last out? One moment. It appears that when they returned from their planetary excursion, he went to the Bay officer's mess while Lord Odo went to the bridge. Lord Odo doesn't eat on the bridge, does he? He hasn't so far, the officer said. Soro typically brings food back to their quarters for him. Any particular types of foods? There have only been 3 meals, so I can't make any generalizations, the officer said. But so far it's been a different menu each time. Would you like a list? Yes, send it to me, Pelion said. A person's taste in food and drink could be useful clues in establishing his identity. And set up a standing order to inform me whenever Soro leaves his quarters. I presume Captain Drusen has already told you to keep track of them both. Yes, sir, he has. Good. Carry on. Pelion keyed off the intercom, and for a moment he gazed off into space. Then, settling himself in his chair, he began punching computer keys. Somewhere on his way to gaining the Emperor's trust, someone had to have crossed official paths with Odo, Soro, or the Sabalan's Hope. Wherever and whenever this was, Pelion was going to find out.